everybody. I'm Joe Voris here at Stonegate this morning with the Executive Director from Stonegate, Linda Henderson. Welcome once again to the Small Business Showcase. Today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity and fraud prevention. And if you stick around to the very end, we're going to have several great tips on how to improve your cybersecurity at your small business. So, Linda, if you want to go ahead and introduce our guests.
Okay. Well, today we're visiting with Stacy Strunk with Skylark Solutions, and today's focus is cybersecurity and fraud prevention for small businesses. This small business showcase, we started out with the Small Business Center talking about how to start a small business and support resources to folks interested in starting a business. Now, today we're focusing on small businesses and how resources out there to protect them and from cybersecurity attacks. And today we're meeting with Stacy Strunk, as I said. And Stacy, we're going to let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Great. My name is Stacy Strunk, originally from the Bedford area. I actually moved back to this area after being in Nashville, Tennessee from college, and started working, surprisingly or interestingly enough, at the old copy trolley building for Premier Data Systems. And they were relatively new to the area. We're talking 93. So there weren't a lot of computers utilized in small business at that time. As a matter of fact, of the clients that we focused on, most of them were medical offices. I can remember working with several medical offices that used them primarily for billing purposes, and after working with them for a short period of time, decided to actually go out on my own. So I started Strunk Consulting, which I was fortunate enough to have a pretty good base of clients already in this area that I was working with, especially focused around the Square. So I focused here at the Square as well. As a matter of fact, over the course of the years that I've been in business, I've had an office on every side of the Square at one point or another. 2014 started focusing a lot more on clouded solutions, which was really new at the time. And then in 2017, 2018, because of the advent of that increased activity, really started to focus on solutions involving cybersecurity. 2018 started working really closely as well with the InfraGard division of the FBI, which is the private sector and public sector collaboration platform related to cyber threats and cybersecurity, and have been doing so pretty much ever since, focused on small businesses, medium-sized businesses, as well as individuals who fall subject and fall prey to those kinds of attacks.
Very good. I noticed some of the information that you shared prior to this podcast in preparation that Indiana ranks like 8th as far as cybersecurity complaints. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit? This sort of stresses the point why this podcast is important for small businesses.
Sure. Well, I think that as anyone could probably guess over the years, it has just continued to increase. The idea that sometimes it takes a moment to stop and think that, the advent of the internet really ushered in a lot of that activity as far as threats go, and it has just exponentially increased. The FBI has been pretty heavily involved in gathering statistical information and releases a report annually in regards to that, listing not only by state, but age groups, the types of threats, the types of frauds that they're experiencing, and the increase that's seen every year. And even from last year, we've seen a roughly 33% increase in threats overall dedicated towards small business, and they are again oftentimes the largest low-hanging fruit, as we say, and target for attacks in the United States.
So there's like a bullseye on small businesses, apparently. Can you share what some of the vulnerabilities are to small businesses, things that they need to be mindful of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key factors in discussing such a topic is that a lot of times small businesses or small business owners don't understand the ramifications of their lack of activity involved in cybersecurity and being proactive about that. When I first started working with computers in the the mid to late 90s, viruses that we had were often distributed by floppy disks, or they were pretty harmless in the fact that they were about bragging rights. Like somebody created some kind of program that when you launched it, that it would say something clever on your screen. It wasn't vindictive per se. It wasn't about anything other than just some bragging rights. And then with the advent of the internet, and then in the early 2000s, we certainly started seeing a shift in those types of situations. So cyber threats and those types of things like antivirus or virus issues or attacks were really starting to become more about malicious activity. It became about, destroying information or capturing information, taking it ransom, ultimately driven by money, become about theft, becomes about fraud. So there's been a really big shift in that activity. And as a result, it's certainly outpaced a lot of times what small business either looks at or considers as being a viable threat. And one of the reasons I think, again, that small business ends up being such a target is because that the threats outpace what they're doing, small businesses effectively doing to protect their information, they become a real source of lateral movement. And by that, I mean hackers, as they're often, have been, the phrase has been used. It used to be about brute force. Somebody would try to steal passwords, and they had a library list of passwords that they would use, and utilizing tactics called brute force, and that being that they tried to force their way into systems to get what they wanted. And today, what we see is that they utilize things like social engineering. We utilize email. They use the weakest link, which is a lot of times employees because of lack of training. And they steal credentials for their email, for their systems, for websites. They fall subject to breaches, and they end up moving laterally. Laterally meaning they may be there for some period of time, and no one is aware of that. They're not monitoring systems. They're not monitoring their platforms, and they lay in wait. So we call them actors, bad actors. So they're doing malicious activity, and what they'll do is they'll stay in a small area like a small business, and they'll monitor emails, they'll monitor traffic, what kind of activity's happening. And when they see an opportunity, they may move on that, they may act on that, or they may actually move laterally into another environment that's connected with them so that they could hit the bigger fish. So sometimes for a small business, it may not be your business that's the target. It may be the fact that you're involved with something that they see a better opportunity so that they can move laterally and then take advantage of that. I think the other thing with small businesses is that they all keep a tremendous amount of data. Unlike when I first started in this field, in the mid 90s, there wasn't a lot of information or a lot of data kept on computers. And now we're not only talking about computers, but we're also talking about the internet. We're talking about clouded environments. So small businesses oftentimes are unaware of what kind of digital assets, as we call them, they actually have. Mm-hmm. So bad actors don't necessarily want money from you. Maybe they want data. They want information. They want, what information do you have that's going to help us move laterally into someone else? And that could be any number of things as they move further up the chain. We're a very interconnected world today, and chances are, as we used to say, the 7 degrees of separation from somebody else, that's very much true with small business. And unfortunately, my experience has shown me that a lot of small to medium-sized businesses just aren't prepared until after an attack. And that's where a lot of the problem lies.
So what are some steps that small businesses can do right now, today, to start moving forward to protect themselves and protect their customers and other collaborators that they work with if they're not the initial target?
Well, I think first and foremost is always education. I think that for a lot of my experience in the past with small to medium-sized businesses, or individuals for that matter, is a lack of knowledge. And unfortunately, there is so much going on every day, and it happens at such a fast pace and a rapid pace that it is difficult to keep up with. I think that educating themselves is probably one of the most important things that anybody can do. For a small business, again, like I've said previously, is that a lot of times they're in a reactionary mode. They don't really pursue doing anything until they've had a breach or they've had something that has infiltrated their environment, which happens regularly every day. So I always think that that's a good place to start, is the more you know, the better off you're going to be prepared. And there's so many resources that are available for that to happen. I think the other thing that a business has to do is they also have to be aware of what their digital assets are. And by that, I mean, you just take an average office. A lot of times over the course of years, they've gotten several computers. Maybe they've updated their computers. They've replaced their computers. And they're unaware of what data they actually do have. Where does it sit? Is it in the cloud? Is it on someone else's server? Is it in a closet somewhere where we've put a machine away? That oftentimes are forgotten. I have worked with several offices and here, especially in the last decade, where businesses are closing, or certainly since COVID, where businesses are retiring. Maybe someone's not taking over. They have a tremendous amount of data that they've maintained over the years, and they don't know what to do with it, or maybe they don't even think about it. Another thing that they could do is, especially with clouded environments, is multi-factor authentication. MFA is what the term shortened there is. A lot of businesses are unaware of the fact that multifunction and multi-factor authentication is very essential and very important to making sure that those environments aren't breached without their knowledge.
Can you give an example of multi-factor?
Yeah, sure. So probably the most widely adopted platform today has been the Microsoft Office platform, and of course Microsoft Office Outlook, which is a lot of people use for their office email and for small business. And in the course of the last few years, especially, Microsoft has moved to a subscription-based service, which is clouded. And by that, I mean the data doesn't necessarily sit just on your computer. The idea was that whatever device you use, your information was available there as well. So your Word documents, your Excel documents, whatever you generated in your platform. Well, while that's a great idea, the reality in practice is that anytime anyone gathered that information and had access to your username and password, they also had access to that same information. Multi-factor authentication really came into play, where when you sign into that environment, it asks you to verify that you're the one signing in. So for example, you would get a text. And I think everybody's familiar with that to some degree. You probably have some kind of professional service that you sign up with, even your banking, that when you log in, it sends you a message to verify that you're legitimately the one that should be doing so. And it's surprising that in the early onset of all those environments, even banking, that wasn't always the case. It didn't ask you to verify that information in a secondary format. So that is something that I still know a lot of businesses haven't actually addressed and implemented in their environments, is multi-factor authentication. And so, the reason I say that's really important is because, again, with the advent of the lockdown that we had with COVID, a lot more people were working at home. A lot more people were working remotely. And now a lot of people are utilizing their personal devices, your phones, for their work as well. They're utilizing tablets. Could be any number of devices that they're utilizing that information. And it becomes really super important in all of those situations that they're utilizing multi-factor authentication because those devices are always subject to being stolen or lost or you leave it somewhere, and that information could easily be accessed when multi-factor authentication is not implemented.
Stacy, another thing with passwords is how many businesses use password managers or anything like that to have a unique password for each account that they have?
I like the fact that people ask those kinds of questions, because I have been doing this for so long. I've been able to progress with the technology as it's happened, and I've seen practices that people have adopted, or again, just social engineering, if you will, that they continue to perpetuate. And one of those is definitely passwords. What I have seen over the course of the last 30 years is that, especially with older people, my age or whatever, and we've been doing this for a while, we tend to use the same passwords for everything. Maybe it wasn't an issue in the early days, but certainly now that everything is interconnected, it only takes one breach of a service that your email address is used at. And if you utilize the same password and a variant of that password, which is really easy,
Right.
then it becomes that much easier to try that set of credentials somewhere else. It's really hard to think about the fact that literally when someone like Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, has a breach, and someone steals someone else's credentials, in a matter of just seconds, all of those credentials could be utilized on thousands, if not tens of thousands of websites immediately to see which ones hit and which ones ping. So yes, that has always been a big issue, has been passwords, people utilizing the same passwords, or again, variants. And that's easy to figure out, because now, especially with the advent of AI, it doesn't take very long for all kinds of variants to be ran immediately.
Right. I'm thinking of sometimes I'll go to a small business, they'll have passwords on sticky notes stuck to their monitors, which is probably not a good idea.
Yeah, and that's, again, it's a common practice.
Yeah.
And people don't think about really simple things like this. A snapshot on your phone, selfie, in your office with friends, and you post it on Facebook or social media, and someone zooms it, and lo and behold, in the background there on your cubicle wall is a password. And it doesn't matter if it's a password for a site that you have there with it. Someone's going to try that password on all kinds of sites. It gets cataloged. And there are services out there that are nation state sponsored. You're talking countries that monitor and keep track of databases of passwords and sell them readily available on the dark web, the deep web, whatever you want to call it. Right. Obviously, the commercial-facing internet that we all see is just the tip of the iceberg of information that's out there all over the world. And once it's on the internet, once any kind of digital information is there, it's always there. It never, ever goes away.
Right.
Even if you delete it, it's still there.
Right.
Password managers, that's a really good point, because there have been some really popular ones over the years that even I, as a business early on, would recommend. LastPass comes to mind. Dashlane is another one. Those were all platforms, and there are still many that are really good, that you have a master password that maintains your database, and you have unique passwords for every website that it maintains. But in the event that you fell to a breach with that master password, then all of those other passwords that you had also fall subject to that breach. So while I think those are great services, and there are some good ones, you do have to keep up with their own breaches. I know that each one of those I mentioned had breaches of their own and notified their clientele, the customers, that they had those. But the great thing about the advent of those since then is that now they have tools in place that when that happens, they notify you through the app of those breaches, and you can quickly change passwords with just a click. You can change those passwords and take place. Okay. Excel was another one. People used to maintain Excel spreadsheets with their passwords, and that was something that was really popular for years. And again, really bad idea, because it's something that's easily and then place it on the internet, in a clouded environment, subject to breach.
Yeah. it just seems to be, and I would think for a small business where you have multiple people, or even a nonprofit organization where you may have different people, keeping those passwords, having passwords met, the multi-factor, making sure you have your phone there, if you have an authenticator app, things like that. It does add a lot of layers that some small businesses, I'm sure, just don't want to do. But the risk to them, the liability, I noticed in some of the notes you gave us about, I maybe 30% of small businesses fail after a security breach or something like that.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, that number is almost 66% of them.
Okay.
After a severe ransomware attack or something like that will
Higher,
actually
yeah.
fold in a short period of time. And the reason being, especially with ransomware, okay, ransomware is typically a situation where your information that you have on your system is encrypted. And the encryption, usually what they want you to do is they want you to pay a ransom. And you know, now with the advent of with Bitcoin or any kind of coins like that, that's the way that they're able to gain that money. They want you to pay a certain amount of ransom, then we'll unlock your data and send it back to you. Rarely, the number I think you might be thinking about is that, you know, only about 30% of them get all of that data back when they pay a ransom. The thing with extortion is that you might give someone a taste of their data back and say for this amount of money, but then what prevents them from saying, okay, well, we still have about 10% of your data here. If you give us $50,000, then we'll give you the remaining amount, like maybe the most recent information that you might really be looking for. So it's very rare that anybody gets back all of the data from paying that kind of extortion or paying for something like that. And I have experienced several businesses that didn't have backup, or they didn't have a plan, they didn't have the things in place, and as much as they struggled and tried to, it was just more effort and more cost to try to recover than it was to just, one, start over, or two, retire, or you know, just fold the shop. I mean, it's when faced with a breach or something like that where your information is ransomed, it's like a fire. It can become overwhelmingly stressful to the point that you just can't think. And if you don't have a plan in place in advance and you're trying to be very reactionary to the situation, it again can be so overwhelming that I think that there are some who just say it's just not worth it,
Right.
especially a small business.
And Stacy, we'll circle back around. Well, you started out talking about the importance for being aware of cybersecurity and educating yourself. And, you know, small business who are operating on a shoestring, are there some inexpensive or low-cost trainings out there or tutorials that small businesses can sign their employees up for, require their employees to take online, or to get some basic information as a protective factor for their business?
Absolutely. Well, as you can imagine, there's a wealth of information out there. And there are websites and there are publications that are geared towards that very thing for small businesses. Certainly someone could reach out to our office and we would find the best fit for them for whatever environment they're in. The reason I say that is because there are very specific things for very specific markets and targets. Medical, as you can imagine, has a completely different set of credentials and requirements related to HIPAA or things like that their employees need to be aware of. I think those are the types of things that people obviously know a lot more about today. HIPAA is a great example. There are other things for being in our area that are government contractors, for example, like NIST compliance. And we've certainly seen many advents of those requirements over the course of years as more information is out there. So I think specifically retail marketing, like manufacturers, there's all kinds of different resources for each one of those targets that will help them. A great example of a client that I have here in Bedford that they do mock ransomware attacks, or they'll do infiltrations. We call it pen testing, which is short for penetration testing. The idea being is that they'll send out a random email to somebody in the organization and make it look legitimate to see how they'll reply, how they'll respond. And and then they'll turn right back around and explain to them, here's what you did, here's what you should or shouldn't have done.
Sort of like a mystery shop, or there's some.
Yeah. And I only know of a few here in town that are doing that in Lawrence County, I should say, and it really should be more widespread in regards to that. Which brings a good point, not only about passwords, multi-factor authentication, all of those things. As I'm sure that everyone is probably aware, the weakest link is always going to be the employee. The passwords is a great point, because when it comes time to require a password change, a lot of systems didn't require that. You didn't have to change your password unless you forgot it, or a lot of people save their passwords in their browsers for the websites that they visit most regularly. Not a good idea. Not a good idea to business at all. But we all have this reaction when we have to change our password. You roll your eyes, and then you start trying to think of things, and that's where we get into a situation where we make things either easy or a variation of a previous password, a situation where it's a very weak spot, and we don't want to do it. Most people don't want the multi-factor authentication. I don't want to reply to a text. I don't want a phone call. I don't want an app. Which brings up a good point. We used to have, it would text you to make sure you are who you say you are. Those can be intercepted now. So we started using apps, like Microsoft has the Microsoft Authenticator app you put on your phone. LastPass has one, GoToAssist or GoToMyPC. They all have their own now, where the codes that they give you expire after 15 or 20 seconds, something like that. But people in our environments are oftentimes, in the work environment, are the weakest link in that, because they get to a point where they're doing things so repetitively that they just don't pay attention, or they've got so much other stuff going on. And maybe in a small business especially, you got one person wearing so many hats that in the course of the day, our minds can trick us into being susceptible to an attack without our knowledge of it. And I'll give you a great example of that. And I think we discussed this a little bit before. Had a client here in Lawrence County who, as most of us in business, have our own domain. For example, it's company123.com. So it was CEO at company123.com. And this particular individual, this CEO, was often not in the office. I mean, he worked outside of the office. He traveled for business, did a lot of stuff at other facilities around Indiana and Kentucky. And at some point in time, he had inadvertently given up his credentials for his email, Office 365, and it was being monitored by bad parties, by bad actors. And the people who were doing that saw an opportunity, because they did a lot of wire transfers related to business. So this particular set of bad actors ended up obtaining a domain name, purchasing a domain name, and it was company123.com. This is just an example. And just switched the letters A and N, okay, in the word company. So in looking at it, when it would say CEO at company123.com, it was misspelled. It wasn't company123.com. But here's what happens. This is what happens when we're busy and our brains are so overwhelmed with details. When we look at something like that on a screen, our brain will see the right email address. So when this person started bad acting and impersonating the CEO at company123.com, sent out this email to the appropriate people in the finance department and in the sales department. I mean, had it all planned out, right? Lay in wait for, I think it was like a total of 42 days between the time they infiltrated and the time they started acting on that infiltration. And in the course of just a few hours that morning, started the process of, oh, by the way, when you're getting ready to do this wire, We have a new Swift code, and this is what this particular customer's Swift code is now, and did it all by email. No actual conversation by phone, no actual conversation in person. And I mean, in this particular case, it wasn't a tremendous amount of money, but it was still, $35,000, $40,000 of a wire that took place, and it all completely looked legitimate. And that's common anymore. It's really common.
Yeah,
and it happens regularly, even to the smallest of businesses. And it may not be a wire transfer, but that kind of stuff happens every day.
I've known some people who that's happened in the business where they get a legit invoice from a company they deal with in Mexico or something.
Yep.
Something just triggers them, said, do we owe this money? And they contact someone else. They say, no, that's a scam.
Yep.
But they almost wire transferred $10,000 to someone in Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely. And since the Office 365 platform is so widely used and accepted, bad actors know that, and as a result, these computer systems just blanket people with, oh, your password's expiring. You need to change your password. And it looks legitimate. It looks like it's from Microsoft. It looks like it's from Yahoo. It looks like it's from Outlook.com. And people will just, again, your people in your offices and even CEOs, they fall subject to this, where it's like, it must be time to change my password. And they, in the course of filling it out, it'll say, well, you have to know your old password to get your new password. And boom, just like that, you've given up your credentials, and that lateral movement takes place really, really quickly. And texts, now we all get texts that say Riverlink. There's a great example. How many of us go south of the river and it says, hey, you went across the river and your Riverlink payment is past due. It's $8, and I guarantee you some people probably stop and think, well, I've not been across the river to pay Riverlink. But if you send it to 10,000 people, let's say you got 1,000 people that hit it for $8.
I know 2 people who did.
Yeah, and
Gave
then
their
you
credit
think,
card
and
info.
what are you going to do about it?
Yeah,
$8. It's going to cost more time and effort to go after $8 than it is to just say, "Hey, they got my $8."
Well, Stacy, that brings up a good point. You wouldn't go after someone for $8 because it just wouldn't be worth your time or money. But what are the steps, or what should a small business do? What is their obligation to folks if their data is breached, and what are the next steps for a small business?
Well, 2 very, very specific things. One is a cyber threat, the other one being cyber fraud. And I think it's clear it would do well to identify those. A cyber threat would be something where you're threatened with, your information being stolen, or your information's being stolen and what they're going to do with it. Cyber fraud then comes into play where, in fact, money's involved. So 2 very different things as far as the level of how they're viewed. I think that what's really important is that when someone does fall subject to something, is that they have to take the correct course of action and identify what it is that has been stolen, what's been breached. If there's been a breach, what information was stolen. And this comes back to the digital asset issue. A lot of companies don't know what kind of information they have. I mean, if you have QuickBooks, for example, you have customers' names, addresses, you might have account information and things like that, but you may not necessarily have Social Security numbers. If you're doing payroll, you have a payroll system, then obviously that comes into play. You got to have information about that and know how to update those people. So one of the first course of actions that any small business needs to do is of course they need to lock down their systems. They got to determine where in fact the breach took place, and then try to isolate that as much as possible. The state of Indiana, for the most part, just says you have to update or notify people within a reasonable amount of time. And while there doesn't seem to be any black and white in that, it's generally within 30 to 60 days of a breach taking place that you need to, let your people know, let your customer base know. A lot of times, small business or medium-sized businesses don't think about the lateral movements. So not only do you need to let those people know, but you need to let your supply chain know. So people that you do business with to purchase your goods, your services, I mean, anybody that you would have in there as not only a vendor, but, somebody that you do business with. But I mean, there's a whole gamut of the people that sometimes small businesses just don't think about. I think the other thing that's really important is to utilize services like ours, like Skylark, where we can help them to navigate that. You brought up a really good point earlier, which is that, they've got limited resources. So you want to get the most bang that you can for your efforts and your activities. I think something, too, that's really important to bring up is I know that I've talked with businesses over the last decade anyway, where they think that I have cybersecurity insurance. Okay, so we're going to utilize that to take care of it. That's what it's for. And now we're seeing offices like mine are inundated with requests from clients that we work with that they have their insurance companies now requiring them to fill out forms associated with what they call errors and omissions, which is what of these things do you have in place in the event of a cybersecurity, in the event of a breach. And a lot of times now what we're seeing is that the payout that an insurance company will do is very much predicated by what level of steps that they took to protect themselves. So while you may have $1 million coverage, they may not very well be paying out that amount of money if you didn't have certain things in place for those errors and omissions. So I always tell people as a small business, it's best to check with your insurance company to find out what their writer and what their underwriter says specifically about what are you expected to have in place in order to utilize those funds.
If someone knows that they've had a breach, where would be the go-to report? Where would they start as far as reporting something to get started on alerting people?
Sure. So obviously, because of my involvement with the InfraGard division of the FBI there, the first thing I would always say is to fill out the IC3 report, which can be found through the FBI's website or the InfraGard website, or to certainly reach out again to someone like myself who can assist them with filling that out. There's a certain amount of information that they want that a lot of times I think most small businesses or individuals that are responsible in the small business don't really understand or don't know. So they're going to be looking for that kind of information to assist them in completing that report. And the more information you supply, the better off you're going to be as possible in recovering what's been lost, what kind of resources someone else is going to put towards that, and that goes a long way. I think it's important, and if there's anything I would say to a small business that's listening or an individual that's listening now for business is identifying somebody in the company who's a responsible security person. And that a lot of times involves creating a security plan. Maybe there's a team of people, 2 people who, in the event that we think something's going on or we're not sure, we have procedures and policies in place in advance so that we're not reacting. We're being a little bit more proactive. And that was one of the things that I wanted Skylark to do when I started getting involved with cybersecurity, was taking more of a proactive approach rather than being reactive. And the reason I say that is because the bad actors are always going to be steps ahead. I mean, it's just the nature of the way that things work is you have to wait for them to develop a technology or a threat or a breach tool so that you can react to it. And the term that we utilize for that is called a 0 day. There's no way of knowing about it until the day that it happens. But if you have a plan in place, regardless of what kind of attack you might fall subject to, you can apply those principles to that situation so that you're not overwhelmed by it in itself.
Yeah. And I should have mentioned this sooner. At the end of this podcast, Stacy's information, Skylark Solutions contact information will be at the end of this podcast for folks. We had talked earlier before we started the podcast. what role does the Indiana Attorney General play in this? Or do you contact them, the consumer protection folks, or go straight to the FBI and fill out that form that you mentioned?
Yes. So the IC3 report will have a section there that will actually identify or have you identify if you have in fact contacted your state attorney general office. Now, it's going to vary by state what their requirements are. And the best thing to do is to probably, when you are subject to something, would be to look at or reach out to the state attorney general office to find out what their recommended course of action is. If you've had what personal information being things like names, numbers, addresses, social security numbers, maybe credit card information, certainly, those kinds of things, then you are required to contact your state attorney general's office and file the appropriate information so that that you at least have identified, you've been subject to a breach and what course of action you're taking from there. And it is also your responsibility as a business owner to reach out to those who've been subjected to the breach, and not the state attorney general's office. So the responsibility is on the shoulders of the business owner or whoever's responsible for that business. And that's something else that I think is still kind of lacking, is an understanding of, of that, how important that is. The reason I say that is, and it wasn't here in Lawrence County, but I have been involved where I was brought in as a consultant on a couple of situations, very small business, and chose not to report that. And I mean, this was maybe 10 years ago, but still, I have to believe that from my resources that I have and the communication I have over the years, is that's still a pretty common practice as to whether or not they choose to report that. And the level of liability on their part is greater now because of that. And I think everyone sees that with the emails and the mails, the mailings that we get about these class action suits against certainly larger companies. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it would take very much for a small business to be greatly impacted by a suit.
Yeah, there's an article in the Indianapolis Star this week about AT&T breach and the class action law settlement that's coming down the pike for customers. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Stacy, to kind of summarize things, first, have there been any questions that we should have asked you that we haven't asked you? Is there something we've not touched on that you want to be sure that our viewers are made aware of?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is the most daunting for people is just knowing where to start. Mm-hmm. And while even listening to this, the light bulb may have clicked on, and they were like, I really need to make a plan, or we need to have a plan. I think it's important for small businesses to realize, because this is often the question, why should I be concerned? I'm just here in Lawrence County. I'm just a small mom pop. We're just a store, or we're just a gas station, or, we're just doing, something simple at home for that matter, small business wise. But small business, the bad actors that do this for a living, looking for information and looking for opportunity, count on small businesses to not be prepared. They're the low-hanging fruit, and so they're looking for opportunities.
So the cybersecurity plan, that is something your company could come in and help a small business develop a plan?
Yeah, absolutely, or point them in the right direction. Okay. I love helping people, and I love educating people, and which is one of the reasons why I got involved with the InfraGard, because a lot of that is basically doing just this, communicating with people and letting them know about resources. So I think that's really important. And I think that sometimes businesses just need an evaluation. Mm-hmm. Are we taking all the steps that we could to, at least on our budget, do the things that we can to protect ourselves? And if not, then who could we turn to? And I talk to companies all the time who say, well, we've outsourced our IT and they're handling that. That's a great idea. I'm all about that. But sometimes you need to have a backup to your backup, a plan to that. And I speak to that from experience. After 30 years of doing this, I've learned from a lot of mistakes I've made in this field. And I think that having as many eyes on your situation, having as many eyes on your business and your plan, if you have one, is not a bad idea. If you're outsourcing it to someone already, a third-party company, maybe a professional company like Carbonite for backup or any number of services, you always want to have someone who's testing the environment and evaluating it that's not in the environment with you, so that you have a really good idea as to whether or not it's effective or not. It would be really easy for me to be doing those services for a company, providing them firewall, endpoint security, backup, and all that, and then say, oh yeah, you're protected. Nothing's going to happen. Because I'm obviously going to say that about, the environment I'm managing for you. But having someone from outside of that try to penetrate and find out where the weak links might be is always a good idea. So I often tell people, if you just need a consultant that's going to come in and maybe come up with a plan for you to do your testing on your own, of your employees, and coming up with a plan for education. Education's the big thing with employees, so they know what a threat looks like, to know when they're susceptible, to know what do I do when I have a question about, who do I go to when I have a question about something, or I just want to make sure. I just want to know that I can ask somebody. I'll give you a great example. I had a situation where we consulted with someone, fell victim to a breach, and did a wire transfer. And the two people that were involved in the process were literally sitting across the desk from each other, never talked to each other about it, never verified anything. It was all happening by email. And took the word of it, that one email to the other one right across the desk from each other, that it needed to happen. And it was like something like $90,000, $100,000, of which they were able to stop and get some of that money back. But that's a great example of just educating your people to say, follow it up with a phone call, follow it up with a real person communication, just to make sure that what you're asking me to do is legitimate.
And just to kind of, as we come to the end of the podcast here, you had a section here that you gave us what small business can do right now to improve cybersecurity. We've talked about some of that, but let's just go through. First of all, you have number one, turn on multi-factor authentication. I think we
absolutely
talked about that. I don't know if there's anything more to that, but turn on MFA. Number two, review and strengthen your password practices using password manager. And one thing you have down here, which I think is great, is a lot of people think a complex password has to be a bunch of letters, numbers, symbols, and gibberish, but you can use passphrases.
Absolutely. Passphrases was introduced to me actually through a contact that I had with the FBI years ago when we hosted a cybersecurity summit. And while I have used them in the past, to think about them so widely used with people, I hadn't really done that. This was in 2019, I think, but made great sense to do just that. And a lot of people, when we started with passwords, it had to be four digits or whatever, and then it was 6 digits, and now we're like to 14 with a capital letter and a number and a dollar sign, or whatever the case is. And but it requires, the complex passwords requires that you notate that somewhere in some way. And when you do that, it falls prey to being found out, as does any password. But when you use a password phrase that's unique and something you can remember, it gives you the ability to be away from the office, away from home, wherever the case is, and you can remember that password without necessarily writing it down and recording it.
Okay. Number 3 you had here was train your employees. I think we discussed that a little bit, but just making them aware. And I know as you were speaking about the ransomware, in my days at NLCS, we would get the emails, I think they still do, to see, are you going to click on this or are you not going to click on this? And they test the employees that way. So that's a good way to check on that. Number 4, implementing a reliable backup strategy.
Yeah.
And I think we discussed that. Anything else you want to add about how to do that? But I think we have talked about that.
Yeah.
And here's one, number 5, keeping all systems updated.
Yes.
Making sure you put those patches in, just like you get the iOS updates every
Absolutely.
few.
And I don't, this is a great time to talk about that because October's around the corner. Microsoft is going to be officially discontinuing their support of Windows 10.
Windows 10, yes.
And I had a conversation this morning, so it's a great point to bring up. I have clients who have systems that will not upgrade automatically to Windows 11 because they don't meet some of the requirements.
Right.
And there's some hardware issues related to that. And they're like, well, what's going to happen? Is my system going to quit? Again, hearkening back to the days of Y2K, what's going to happen? Nothing's going to happen. Your system will continue to work. The issue there is that when a vulnerability is found out by Microsoft or someone else, a third party, they are going to stop at some point in time patching those fixes and then pushing them out to people. Now, how long that will actually take place is difficult to say. I have seen in the past, like with Windows 8, Windows XP, where medical offices are still utilizing those systems and they're like, well, we need a patch because, this system cannot be upgraded yet. We have to wait for it. And, sometimes those will happen. But at some point in time, Microsoft will stop those, and that's going to put you in a greater level of threat level, a greater position of being subject to that. And so as a business, you have to decide what level you're willing to put yourself there as a liability.
Yeah.
And so you have to take the steps necessary. And again, that's something that if someone wants to reach out to us and verify for them, we can certainly help them with.
Okay. 6, you had create a simple incident response plan. We talked a little bit about that. And as you say, it can be short. It can be one page. It doesn't have to be multi-pages.
No. And I think you have to have someone identifiable in your organization who can just be responsible that you can go to and say, I think this is happening. How do we find out?
Right. And number 7, talk to a pro about a security assessment, such as yourself, who can give a consultation or something to kind of assess your needs. So I think those are 7 great tips for how small businesses can do something today. Really, just start making the moves to improve your cybersecurity.
It just starts with a step. Just taking a course of action and making a plan. It doesn't even have to be the plan that you stay with. It could be something it's going to grow and evolve. And that's, as the threats evolve, the plan has to evolve too.
Linda, anything else?
Very good. No, Stacy, I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank viewers for watching, and check out our Stonegate YouTube page as we continue to expand our small business showcase, bringing hopefully valuable and informative information to folks. And again, thank you for viewing our podcast. Thank you.